G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas and the ultimate dangerous idea, the dangerous idea to rule all dangerous ideas, the Rosetta Stone of dangerous ideas, the Magna Carta of the dangerous idea is the question of what a free and open society should do about hyper-dangerous ideas. How should you deal with them? Is it a little bit old-fashioned to say, well, a bad idea, especially if it's full of hate, should just be combated with better ideas? And if someone is out in the street saying that we should kill all the Jews, then we just have to sit them down and have a reasoned conversation and persuade them that actually neo-Nazism is not the best way forward. Or is there a case to be made for a civilized society, a multicultural society, a society that wants to be a pleasant place for people to live, to put some stricter limits than many Americans would be comfortable with, stricter limits than the American Supreme Court would be comfortable with, given America's First Amendment, on what people can say and the kinds of hateful things and ideas that they can express. This is something that's happening in Australia right now, both at a federal level and at a state level in the two most populous states, New South Wales and Victoria. And this conversation is an absolutely fascinating romp through the intellectual ins and outs of free speech and hate speech with the new incoming president of Australia's Free Speech Union. So if you're not in Australia, don't worry, this is not an Australia-specific conversation. This is really about the philosophical underpinnings of how we should deal with notions and ideas that we detest. I just want to begin by giving you some background, specifically on the latest eruption of cancel culture in Australia. There has been a disinvitation of one of Australia's most promising and exciting artists from the most important artistic festival in the world, the Venice Biennale. This is sort of like Sundance or Cannes is to film. This is to the art world. And there's been a huge controversy in the sort of higher echelons of Australian art because Khaled Sabsabi is a Western Sydney artist. That's a working class, sort of migrant-heavy part of the city. He's a Lebanese-Australian guy, working class background, and has been doing really exciting art, apparently. I mean, I'd never heard of him because I don't swim in these circles, but the art world was kind of really excited in Australia that he had been selected as essentially Australia's ambassador to the Venice Biennale in 2026, Australia's representative. Then, Australia's Shadow Arts Minister, Claire Chandler, stood up in Parliament and asked this question.
My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Wong. The Australian government-funded organisation Creative Australia has announced that Khaled Sabsabi will be Australia's artistic representative to the Venice Biennale. Mr Sabsabi features the dead Hezbollah terrorist leader Nasrallah in his artworks. With such appalling anti-Semitism in our country, why is the Albanese government allowing a person who highlights a terrorist leader in his artwork to represent Australia on the international stage at the Venice Biennale?
After that exchange, Australia's Arts Minister, Tony Burke, apparently contacted Creative Australia, which is the nation's peak arts body, the CEO of that organisation, Adrian Collette, to discuss the matter. And the minister says that he made no ultimatum. He said, whatever decision you come to about whether or not Khaled Sabsabi will remain as Australia's representative to the most prestigious art festival in the world next year is fine by me. I'll support whichever decision you choose. The subtext, of course, being that Creative Australia is dependent on government funding and doesn't necessarily want to be engulfed in a massive cultural tempest. So Creative Australia's board convened. They decided to revoke Sabsabi's invitation to the Biennale, and there was significant backlash within the arts community. There were multiple resignations in protest from Creative Australia. The works of art that Sabsabi has produced in the past that have got people riled up and raising their eyebrows include a 2007 artwork which was called You. It depicted the late Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed in an Israeli airstrike last year, and a video rendering that Sabsabi had done of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. This was a work he did in 2006, and it was entitled Thank You Very Much. In a related but unrelated arts story, the head of the Sydney Writers' Festival has resigned after 12 years in the job. She is a Jewish Australian, And she wasn't specific about the reasons for her resignation, but there is a lot of speculation about her discomfort with some of the speakers who'd been invited to the Sydney Writers' Festival. The program hasn't been released yet, so we don't know who they are, but when it comes out on March 13th, ahead of the festival's commencement on the 19th of May, we will perhaps be able to glean some of the more controversial figures who Cathy Shand, the head of the Writers' Festival, felt she needed to resign in opposition over. Her statement said, and I quote, "Artistic freedom and independence are to be guarded and cherished, but freedom of expression cannot and should not be used as a justification to accept language and conversations that compromise the festival as a safe and inclusive space for all audiences. Every session that is planned needs to reflect the values of the festival and represent the highest standard of consideration and curation." I think that's the upstanding thing to do. Cathy is clearly a mensch. You step aside when you disagree, and I suppose you fall on your own sword and you stand up for your own principles, rather than in a cowardly fashion pulling the rug out from under the people who you've already invited. I just need to reiterate once again, cancelling people is not the solution. It really is not. If you've invited Khaled Sabsabi to represent Australia at the Venice Biennale, then just let him go and represent Australia. The idea of a government minister, of a bureaucrat, looking at works of art from 10, 20 years ago, seeing images in them that they find offensive in the context of a current Middle Eastern conflict, of a current spate of anti-Semitism that was not the defining feature of Australia at the time when those artworks were made, and then putting pressure on the world of arts and ideas where we're supposed to be able to wrestle freely, where we're supposed to be able to poke the bear and kick the hornet's nest and try to wrestle with the biggest questions that humanity faces, the idea that those ideals are going to be subjected to the scrutiny of some persnickety bureaucrat or government minister who's reactive to the political winds of the time. No, that does not a free society make. That is not what an open society is about. That's not what a flourishing society is about. That's not what a strong society is about, or a vibrant culture is about. I have no way of judging whether or not Khaled Sabsabi was the correct choice for Australia to send to the art world's highest event in Venice next year, but there were obviously reasons why he was thought legitimate by his peers, by people who know a lot more about the arts than you do, or than I do, or than the arts minister himself, in fact, does, and certainly than the shadow arts minister and the people who are lobbying her to try to get this person yanked from the Biennale do. Once someone's invited, that's it. Lie in the bed that you've made. Now, we can have a long conversation about whether or not there are political preferences and prejudices and biases that have been managed to insinuate themselves into the institutions that are making these kinds of decisions, such that they're more likely to favour an artist like Khaled Sabsabi than they would, for example, a young Jewish artist. I don't know if that's the case. And if that is the case, then we need to have bigger conversations about the way that we're interpreting our multicultural nation, the way that we're interpreting the manner in which we bump up against each other when there are toxic and hostile foreign clashes going on, and the extent to which we import those animosities into our society, the extent to which we allow ourselves to side with one ethnicity over another because of something that's going on abroad. But those are big questions that will not be resolved by us hunting for misdeeds that people have undertaken, allegedly, in the past, and trying to whip up a frenzy against them and get them uninvited, to pressure the arts community, to pressure people who are frankly wrestling with much bigger issues than any politician ever will. Questions of what it means to be human, what it means to be alive, how we deal with ourselves in this cosmos. These are the questions that artists and thinkers and philosophers and creators are wrestling with, not how they're going to get elected, how they're going to placate this one pressure group over another, how they're going to trade off the needs of one angry mob online against the human rights of the rest of the country. Political considerations are on one level. Artistic, creative, and ideas are on another level. Leave them be. There is something worryingly Stalinist about a country that thinks it's appropriate for elected politicians, officials, bureaucrats, and pen pushers to put pressure on artists and thinkers about who they can nominate as the most valuable among them to represent them internationally. Even if it were the case that Khaled Szeps were an anti-Semite, and there is no evidence of that, zero evidence of that, I would still think that the conversation to be had about whether it's appropriate to extend to him an invitation to represent this country needs to happen before it is done, by the people who are involved in the arts, in the world of ideas, not by political hacks after the fact who are essentially breaking down a separation of powers by reaching outside of the political realm and into the artistic realm. My opposition to cancel culture does not stem from any particular outlook. It is a matter of principle. If you disagree with somebody, then attack their ideas. Do not try to have them uninvited. Do not try to sever their ties with their professional employees and their colleagues. Do not try to demean them. Do not call out a mob to harangue them. Push back on ideas, not people. Furthermore, I just find it ridiculous to imagine that someone who is not an artist can look superficially at one instance or two instances of an artist's body of work, see the images that they are portraying, and because he happens to use iconography of Hassan Nasrallah from Hezbollah or of the Twin Towers and George W. Bush after 9/11, you can immediately regard those things as being offensive. What if those things were being used in satire and you're just too stupid to get the joke? What if those things were being wrestled with by someone who's trying to understand the world in a messy and complicated way? It's a little bit like when we try to ban the use of certain words in our conversation. Well, it depends on how you were using the word. It depends on what the comic was trying to say, what point the comic was trying to make. Don't criticize them for making a joke until you understand what the true target of the joke is. Maybe superficially the target of the joke seems to be, Jehovah's Witnesses. But maybe the person, although they're using Jehovah's Witness in the line of the joke, is actually satirizing their own inner prejudice or their own ignorance of Jehovah's Witnesses. We just don't know. That's why we have to allow the sphere of ideas, of thinking, of argument, of conversation, of which the arts are a fundamental cornerstone, to flourish in the absence of political pressure. So I think it's outrageous that Khaled Szeps has been uninvited to represent Australia in Venice next year. I strongly suspect that if Khaled and I sat down and discussed Middle Eastern politics, we would strongly disagree. There may be things that I believe that he would find beyond the pale. He is playing in the world of ideas. A big culture, a strong culture, a vibrant culture, a generous culture would be a culture that says, let him play. It's crucial to bear in mind the difference between endorsing what somebody says versus respecting their right to say it, versus allowing bureaucrats and HR managers in corporations to dictate which artistic and intellectual expressions should be excluded from the public square. Which brings us to hate speech legislation. The backdrop to this is largely anti-Semitism. For the first time in the history of Australia's spy agency, it seems, the head of the Australian version of the CIA, which is called ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, has elevated a form of racism or ethnic prejudice domestically as its top priority, its top threat. Normally it's looking at threats like China or Russia or whatever it might be, but the boss of Australia's chief spy agency, Mike Burgess, has said that no form of domestic racism has ever been elevated, to his knowledge, to the number one concern for ASIO. Now, anti-Semitism is it. In October of 2023, many of you will recall the mobs on the steps of the Sydney Opera House, which were originally erroneously reported to be saying "gas the Jews." What they were actually saying was "where's the Jews?" Not a huge consolation, frankly. Why were they asking "where's the Jews" are? And why weren't they grammatically correct? Where are the Jews? Same month, members of the neo-Nazi National Socialist Network marched in Melbourne in front of Flinders Street Railway Station, the main railway station, displaying a banner reading "Expose Jewish Power" and handing out neo-Nazi literature. Early last year, the personal details of 600 creative people, Australians who work in the creative arts, who were Jewish, who were on a WhatsApp thread, which was basically for support and sort of community support after October 7th, and helping people who might have lost people or might be grieving and so on. Those personal details were doxed and leaked, and that led to some harassment and some death threats. I was originally on that group. Someone invited me, didn't know what it was. It was after October 7th. After a few months, I decided that it was not for me, and I departed with a parting shot to everybody in that group, saying essentially the point that I just made about cancel culture, because they were talking about trying to pressure, well, not all of them, a few loud people, as is always the case. We're talking about trying to pressure publishers, media organizations, podcast networks, whatever it might be, to disassociate themselves from people who were very active online in the pro-Palestinian space. And I was saying, don't do that. Don't do that. If you disagree, if you think that some pro-Palestinian, influencer activist online is verging into anti-Semitism, then fight with the ideas. Don't go behind the scenes and try to get them fired. So I wasn't part of that, but I was part of that group that ended up getting doxed. Then in December of last year, the Adass Israel synagogue in Melbourne was firebombed, set on fire during a morning prayer service. There was significant damage. One person at least was injured. Last month, January, so just to give you a sense of why this hate speech legislation is coming to a head right now. In January, a childcare centre in Sydney was torched and defaced with anti-Semitic graffiti. Same month, last month, a man from Western Sydney was arrested for allegedly posting death threats on a Jewish association's social media page. That was actually the very first arrest ever under this new Australian Federal Police task force, a unit dedicated to combating anti-Semitic crimes. He can get up to 15 years in prison for that. He won't, but he could if he's guilty. Also last month, there was a planned anti-Semitic attack that police found a caravan containing explosives in a suburb that's like a motorhome, in a suburb northwest of Sydney, and it contained a list allegedly of Jewish targets, including the addresses of synagogues. The Premier of New South Wales, which is like the governor of the state, labelled this as a terrorist act officially. And then this month, two men were charged for allegedly vandalising the home in Sydney of the co-chief executive of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, a Jewish community leader. It was fortunately turned out to be his ex-home, but they presumably didn't know that he no longer lived there. They sprayed anti-Semitic graffiti and they destroyed some vehicles. So that's the context into which both the federal government and the state government have leapt to try to say, you know what we need? We need laws. We need stronger laws against all this. So because these homes and schools and synagogues have been set on fire and cars vandalised with anti-Semitic messaging and so on, last month National Cabinet convened to address this spike in anti-Semitic attacks. And their solution was that this month, a couple of weeks ago, the Australian Parliament passed a new law. It's an amendment, technically, to an existing hate crime law, which makes it a crime to, quote, advocate or threaten the use of force or violence against individuals or groups based on attributes such as race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status. It also includes mandatory minimum jail terms. 12 months for waving swastikas or doing the Nazi salute, that kind of thing. 12 months in jail. Would that include like Elon Musk and Steve Bannon if they'd done their salutes in Australia? I don't know. And 6 years in jail minimum for terrorism-related activities. Now, concurrently, and I won't be in the weeds for too long, I promise, but it's worth just understanding the contours of this, Concurrently, New South Wales, the most populous state in the country, has introduced its own measures to combat hate speech and anti-Semitism. And these are even iffier, frankly. It's now against the law to protest near places of worship and impede access to places of worship and harass worshippers, which I kind of understand more. This is aimed to protect religious communities from targeted hate crimes. But the point has been made by some human rights lawyers and others that the law doesn't specify that the protest needs to be related to the place of worship. Like, if there's another pandemic and people want to protest a lockdown, for example, and they happen to be on the same block as a church, then do the police now have additional powers to arrest those people beyond what they would otherwise have because of this new hate speech law, because they're near a place of worship? The literal reading of the text makes it seem so. The New South Wales legislation also includes incitement of racial hatred as a crime, that is, behaviours that promote hostility or violence against individuals based on their race or religion. Again, in America, this probably sounds crazy, right? Given the First Amendment, the idea that you could be arrested criminally, not civilly, but criminally by the police for a behaviour that promotes hostility against a race or religion. Well, to be fair, against individuals based on their race or religion. And it outlaws the display of offensive symbols. It's also worth noting, since we don't mention it in this chat, we don't go into the whole offensive symbols and imagery conversation. Can you imagine a future government having a different interpretation of what offensive symbols are? Obviously, the legislation is not limited to symbols that the legislation explicitly lists. It's just a criminal offence to display offensive symbols. Could you imagine a future anti-Semitic government that regards the Star of David as an offensive symbol of settler colonial occupiers? Zionist puppet masters? Can you imagine an Islamophobic regime that bans the Muslim crescent moon as a symbol of jihad? The state member for Sydney, Alex Greenwich, is opposed to these laws because he says that it's vitally important for vilification laws to apply equally across the community. So, at least in this reporting, and perhaps I have to have him on the show to ask him directly, but at least as it's been reported, he does seem to say that if you're going to do this, then we need to do it for all communities, including the LGBTQIA+ community. He says, quote, "I know from personal experience that neo-Nazis and other hate groups are targeting LGBTQ people as well as people who are Jewish. Protecting one group but not another would be nonsensical, cruel, and inappropriate." He said, and I quote, "It sets a dangerous precedent to provide for the first time protections for one attribute but not others, and it risks sending the message that the government doesn't treat the incitement of hatred against those other groups as seriously." He's got a point, which, as we'll come to in the coming chat, can also be interpreted as a reason for not having hate laws at all, because of the ever-expanding sphere that they should cover. If you're going to protect Jews, why aren't you protecting gay people? And if you're going to protect gay people, why aren't you protecting transgender people? At which point is the claim that biological males can't be women a form of hate speech? It's certainly anti-trans speech, and if we've expanded the purview of hate speech from Jews to gays to transgender people, why not? Last thing I'll say here is that the nurse in that video, the two apparently Muslim nurses who were allegedly talking on a social media video chat app to an Israeli, and who said the following:
"I'm so upset that you're Israeli. Eventually you're gonna get killed and you're gonna go to Jahannam, inshallah."
Jahannam, Arabic for hell.
Why do you think? Why do you think I'm gonna get killed?
It's Palestine's country, not your country. You piece of
One of those nurses now has been charged. And these are offences relating not to anything that she did, apparently, as I understand it, outside of the video, but just to the use of the internet and a telephone service to make those kinds of apparent threats. And these are charges that have up to 22 years in jail. Again, it's highly, highly unlikely that she'd get anything like that. But this is the kind of stuff we're talking about. You don't have to be doing anything other than saying words in Australia now to feel the full force of the law. And the question we raise in this conversation is, what's the most parsimonious way to deal with hatred? I copped a lot of flack last time I spoke about these nurses from listeners who felt that I was being too generous by withholding judgment of them and saying that a mob is not the best way to adjudicate matters such as this. There have been many cases in the past where people have been caught out of context saying something. They thought they were joking. They thought they were being satirical. Maybe they were baited into it. We just don't know. And people were saying, come on. This is a flagrant example of anti-Semitism. If you're too waffly and both sidesy to, if you're such a nuanced bro that you can't even just vocally condemn what is obviously egregious Jew hatred, then where do you even stand on anything? Let me be clear. I think anyone who speaks the way that those nurses spoke should not be working in a hospital. They should feel the full force of whatever professional repercussions come from behaving in such an unprofessional manner. My worry is about the toxic mob climate of cancel culture, where many, many people think and say things that many of us would find beyond the pale and get away with it because they're either not stupid enough or they're just lucky enough not to get caught. And I don't think that the most efficient way to create a more robust and collaborative communication environment is by accidentally stumbling upon one stupid ejaculation of hateful silliness, and then the entire nation and the entire internet of billions of people come down like a ton of bricks on those people and make examples of them, whilst failing to address the context in which they thought that it was okay to say that, their union who came out with a mealy-mouthed opposition to them, sort of saying that what they did was bad. Oh yeah, but Islamophobia is bad too. So what? There is a soup in which we're all swimming that is giving rise to this. And I am just uncomfortable with cherry-picking the easiest example to pile onto. It has been reported that the reason why the female nurse has been charged and not the male nurse is because he continues to be under psychiatric care in a facility because of what he's had to go through, because of what it's like to have the entire world make you the number one story and demonize you and vilify you for something stupid and maybe even hateful and wrong that you did. I've been the target of social media pile-ons. I know what it feels like. This is not the most effective way to impose standards and to adjudicate sensitive issues of hate speech. It reminds me a little bit of Abu Ghraib in 2004, when there was abuse of Iraqi detainee prisoners in Iraq. If you're old enough to remember, it was a scandal, and 2 low-level army reservists went to prison. One of them got 10 years. He ended up serving 6.5 years for mistreating Iraqi detainees. What did Donald Rumsfeld get? What did Dick Cheney get? What did George W. Bush get? What did senior military officers get? I mean, nothing. They launched a war that killed 1 million people. And we spent months in a news cycle in 2004 about how badly the Iraqi detainees were being treated by these guys and how we needed to hound and punish the individuals responsible. The individuals responsible were behaving in a context inside a permission structure where they thought what they were doing was acceptable. They obviously thought that, otherwise they wouldn't have done it and they wouldn't have taken photos of it. And these nurses obviously were operating inside a permission structure where they thought what they were doing was on some level acceptable because they wouldn't have done it on video camera if they hadn't. So their worst crime is of being fuckwits, potentially, allegedly. If the Abu Ghraib guy who ended up getting sentenced to 10 years had just had an F-16, hey, he could have shot the detainees from the sky before they even got to the detention center, and he might have got an Air Force Commendation Medal. This is the kind of inconsistency and hypocrisy that I'm just allergic to. Think if you don't remember Abu Ghraib, think back to the financial crisis in 2008, where a few low-level financial workers were charged for sinking the global economy. And, who was not punished? Top executives from any major financial institution. No top executive at Goldman Sachs. no top executive at Lehman Brothers. Were they blameless? No, they were creating the context in which the people who ended up paying the price, who ended up being victimized, felt that they could operate. So I'm just not crazy about the gleeful hounding of accidental examples of deeper phenomena. The deeper phenomena here is a true sense of antipathy towards Israelis and Jews from large swathes of the community in the West. And that's what a lot of Jews are feeling, and that's something that we touch on in this conversation. So, Alan Davison, formerly the Dean of Social Sciences at the University of Technology, Sydney. He and I worked together there. We had a sub-podcast inside this podcast, I suppose an umbrella, a kind of branded umbrella called Permission to Think, which was fabulous, and you should go back and listen to some of those. It's specifically uncomfortable conversations that relate to the academy and to teaching and to learning and to, the expansion of thought inside universities and so on. We had Jonathan Haidt. We had really interesting thinkers. He's left there now, and he's now the academic lead at the Australian Catholic University's Governance and Public Affairs Centre. And more importantly, he's the new president of the Free Speech Union in Australia. I hope you enjoy, as much as I did, the one, the only, Alan Davison. And where did your interest in free speech come from? Is this because of academia not having been quite as tolerant or open-minded a place as you thought it was going to be? Or
partly. Look, I'm not a libertarian of the libertarian bent, but I consider that free speech is it's the bedrock principle for proper democratic functioning. And also, needless to say, but probably pointless to say, it's absolutely essential for academic inquiry as well. But I think we can probably tease out academic freedom and academic inquiry. That's related to or a subset of free speech and, let's say, open inquiry more generally. So my interest in free speech has stemmed back many years, probably from the writings of folk like Karl Popper, the philosopher who talked about the open society and the closed society. And free speech fits very much within that idea that there should be a free exchange and contestation of ideas, non-violently, obviously. And we can only improve society and we can only progress if ideas get put on the table. And it's through the strength of logic, argument, and evidence. All those things that seem really quaint nowadays, isn't it? To talk about evidence and logic and argument.
Well, I was going to say, even your defense of free speech does sound a little bit like someone's been plonked from either the 1700s or the 1990s into the cacophony of today with
Indeed.
Elon and X and like craziness, and Kanye is literally a Nazi, and to come along and say, well, actually, the free exchange of ideas undergirds all of civilization. You're like, yeah, but can we just not with the kill all Jews? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so what's your retort to that?
That's an excellent point, and I knew it would sound quaint. So let's try to modernize it. Hey, let's try to update it with at least a coat of paint. A commitment to free speech and a free and open society in the vision, say, of Karl Popper or others, does not mean that a blind eye is turned to misogynistic, racist, hateful actions or speech. It's all about what you do about those things. So in other words, if there's people marching down the street saying kill all Jews, it's not that we stand up and go, oh, well, it's their right to say it, we're in an open society. The question is, what are the tools and mechanisms in a 21st century society like ours, and a rich and complex multicultural one as well, with its own history and challenges? What is the appropriate set of responses and tools to address what is openly flagrant anti-Semitism in some cases, but I won't pair it together as often does anti-Muslim sentiment or Islamophobia. That's a different thing to talk about. I do notice, and note this in passing, that whenever a politician gets up and talks about anti-Semitism, they've also got to somewhere else in the paragraph refer to Islamophobia. Two different things. They can be talked about in two different ways. So it's a matter of how best to address the kinds of attitudes, actions, and definitely hateful actions and speech that we do see. So it's a matter of how to address that. And the idea of free speech and a commitment to free speech means don't jump on the immediate response, which is to clamp down through sort of legal tools, suppressing speech. Now, happy to go into that.
Yeah, so why not? What's wrong with the argument that says, okay, don't suppress ideas. So if someone has an idea about something that could conceivably be constructive, allow it into the public square. But there are simply hateful ejaculations of instinct or gut motivation that are fair game to rule out of bounds. So we could all jot on the back of a napkin a bunch of things that we're going to say. We're going to decide communally that in this society, we don't say women are inferior to men. In this society, we don't say kill all the Jews. In this society, we don't say we should lynch black people. Like, what's wrong with just saying, we draw boundaries around speech for defamation, for the purposes of defamation, not crying, not shouting fire in a crowded theatre, all that sort of stuff. Where do you draw the line, and why aren't we entitled to draw the line tighter than you want it?
Well, there are lines already drawn, and in many ways they're reasonably robust. So, incitement towards violence is a very clear one. So if you're marching down the street, say, go and kill this person now, or go and attack these groups of people, that's clear incitement to violence. So I think even...
And that is and should be a crime?
Are you asking for my view personally?
Yeah.
Direct incitements to violence, absolutely, and they are already. So it's not like if there's people marching down the streets calling for the death and destruction of people that are literally around them, perhaps trying to avoid their marches. Absolutely. But you also throw in there ideas like women are inferior to men. Well, they're not. But that's a different type of utterance to saying, let's go and, a call to violence against the thing. So there will always have to be lines drawn. So I suppose the question is, and the position that I would take in the Free Speech Union is, let's start from a position of as much freedom of speech and exchange of ideas as possible, and just be very cautious and very considerate about how we move to address that, moving anywhere away from that sort of absolute freedom, which I agree, absolute freedom is definitely not the state we want to be in. But there are already rules, regulations, policies, and a whole variety of instruments that check the kinds of things that you're talking about, and I don't have any particular problem with them.
Right. So we find ourselves at the moment in Australia in sort of the midst of a conversation about hate speech. There are hate speech laws that have either just been passed or are underway or are being under debate, both at a national level and at a state level in some of the most populous states. Just this week, we saw charges leveled against one of the nurses in that viral video of the Bankstown, of the apparently Muslim Bankstown nurses who were saying that they wouldn't treat Jews and that they threatened to kill Jews. Now one of them has been charged with, I just want to get this right, these are 3 federal Commonwealth offences. One is called threatening violence to a group. That's an offence. Using a carriage service, which basically means a telephone or the internet, to threaten to kill, and using a carriage service to menace, harass, or offend. Those are the 3 charges after this person seemingly bragged about refusing to treat Israeli patients and maybe killing them and saying that they would go to hell. What's wrong with... Is there anything wrong with charging such?
Well, not in my view. Basically, someone saying they have killed or would kill a person of a particular attribute, that's not a free speech matter. That's actually saying that someone with the responsibility to look after the health and well-being of all people that come under their care is actually saying openly they would kill or may kill a certain person with a certain background, certain race, whatever. So that's not free speech. That's just someone making an actual threat or a boast about doing harm.
What if she'd only said all Israeli patients should die?
Then I suppose it's less of a direct threat, and then it's up to institutions like the hospital to decide. They'll have their own professional boundaries and expectations about duty of care, and if you sign up to that organisation and the duty of care is you treat all of your patients with equal concern, then they'd be in breach of that duty of care.
Yeah.
I don't see it as a free speech issue.
Okay. I mean, because the argument could be made, and perhaps will be made by her lawyers, who knows, that this was said in a spontaneous, irreverent exchange with somebody who she didn't know. I mean, I'm inventing this entirely.
Yeah.
I don't know what her defense is going to be, but you could imagine a scenario in which you try to code what is being said as speech, as an opinion,
Yeah.
yet essentially that it's just a clumsy or impolite way of articulating a point of view that Israelis as a group don't deserve our consideration and don't deserve medical treatment and ought to go away and suffer.
Right.
Now, that might be a nasty idea, but that still strikes me as an idea rather than a threat.
Yeah. But again, if they weren't nurses and they weren't actually at their place of work in their scrubs, so it's not like they're attending a stand-up comedy gig.
But nobody's saying they shouldn't be fired.
Yeah.
Well, nobody reasonable is. The question is, should she face potentially up to 2 years in jail?
I think that's where the discussion needs to be had. So in other words, expressing hateful things, and if it's demonstrated that no actual physical harm was caused, then the harm is obviously through the distress of those utterances. So rather than saying yes or no, my point would be we need to have a very considered discussion around where precisely the lines go. Now, it doesn't mean to say a line can't be drawn and has to be drawn. From a practical point of view, we can go from the, overt call for incitement, hatred and murder to the saying an off-the-cuff, rather off-colour remark. Obviously, there needs to be a line drawn somewhere through that continuum. But I think what we're facing at the moment with the raft of hate speech laws coming through at both the state, federal, and also as a sort of global move, is that I think there's many members of the community who are feeling vulnerable and are certainly trying to appreciate the vulnerability that, say, people in the Jewish community may feel when they see this kind of thing. It seems to me that the move towards legislating hate speech just needs to be considered a bit more carefully, because the arguments put forward at the moment are around safety and keeping us safe from hate, and leaving aside the legalistic determination of what is hate from the legal perspective. You get the feeling nowadays that hate is, what's that song, Love Is All Around? It's like hate is somehow everywhere. It's like some kind of pathogen, and we need to protect ourselves from hate. Now, we need to look at that idea that hate is somehow pervasive and on the rise to actual harm being caused by it. And are there better, if you like, countermeasures to addressing or pushing back against the perception of this rise in hate? Hate speech is one type of tool. Hate speech laws is one kind of tool. But I think there's one law that overrides all other law. It's the law to rule them on. That's the law of unintended consequences. I think we need to be very careful if we bring in and clamp down much stronger and more vigorously sort of prosecuted hate speech laws. It's worth thinking about in 2, 3, 5 years' time, there might be different governments, there might be different sway, there might be different communities who are now utilising a set of tools that can have all kinds of consequences beyond the current application of them. And the other thing is, if we're concerned about, and this term gets thrown around a lot, social cohesion, polarisation, if the genuine concern from our intellectual leaders and political betters is that we need to do something to address social polarisation, let's go hate speech route. Okay, good. I'm probably more interested in, let's talk about who's doing the hating, where the hating comes from, rather than how the hate manifests in speech. So if we're in a complex multicultural society and there is significant minorities of people motivated enough to say things like, where are the Jews? Let's kill the Jews, etc. It could be another group, but let's use that as an example. Rather than jumping on the let's ban that as speech, my first argument would be it's good to know they're saying it, as opposed to not saying it. Otherwise, you don't know who's thinking it.
Well, they're going to say it.
They're going to say it.
They're going to say it quietly to each other, or they're going to say it loudly in front of us.
No, they're saying the quiet bits out loud because they feel emboldened to do so. Not pleasant, but let's say that's a hypothesis. Then the next thing is, if we're genuinely worried about social cohesion, we should probably be more worried about the upstream elements that have led to that downstream consequence of making those hateful utterances. And the irony of hate speech laws is that you run the risk of being accused of things like Islamophobia if you talk about certain clusters of beliefs within, say, Islamic communities, particularly the more, if you like, hardcore ones, that might or might not manifest themselves in these kinds of speech acts. But to actually look at the cultural or sociological underpinnings of those very beliefs becomes almost impossible to talk about. Why? Because of hate speech and anti-vilification. So in other words, the cure is actually making the cure at the end of the pipeline, let's whack on hate speech laws, actually makes the deep, nuanced and difficult conversation that we might need to have as a complex multicultural society almost impossible to have, because we need to talk about upstream what is multiculturalism, what is social cohesion, where is our tolerance for intolerance, who decides those things. And it's not necessarily your critical race theorist from a university, and it's not necessarily your politician.
Fascinating. So I'll get you to say that again, and let me try to articulate this, because I think it's a really interesting way of sort of flipping the script on hate speech. Are you implying that had we been less averse to having conversations 15 years ago that might have been coded as hateful or bigoted or xenophobic or Islamophobic or anti-Semitic or whatever, had we been more free and rambunctious in the conversations we were willing to have, we might not have gotten to a point at which the underpinnings of the current moment of hate speech had become so intense and so red hot that the speech that we're currently seeing and the kinds of ideas that were expressed by those nurses would be present, because we would have addressed, I don't know, the integration of Muslim communities into the broader Australian project better, but we weren't able to do so because to talk about that was to be labelled as a hate speecher.
Or assimilationist or something like that.
Right.
And very well put. Yes, no, you've expressed it really well. So
I wouldn't say very well put.
No.
It was like, I mean, I did it. I'd give myself like maybe a 6 out of 10 for that one.
Well, I was 5.5.
Okay, good.
So, but the risk is that in the push and the natural response from many people who feel vulnerable as the targets of hate speech is to jump on something that seems readily available and readily applicable. Hate speech, someone gets charged, bang. It seems very pragmatic approach, is that it will further obfuscate our ability to have conversations about what the upstream causes and being curious about what leads to these views in the first place, and should we be concerned as a collective Australian community that these kinds of views fester, where do they fester, how have they been allowed to fester, and where was the counter speech or counter arguments about those views being openly discussed?
Right.
And for me, jumping on the hate speech bandwagon as a fix makes that other conversation practically impossible.
And we should say, in case this is misconstrued as us, jumping on the Muslim community in Australia needlessly, a similar dynamic can occur with regards to the right and claims of anti-Semitism, where they'll use the cudgel of anti-Semitism as a way of shutting down speech about Israel's, improprieties. So anytime Israel does anything monstrous, and someone points it out, people will say that person pointing it out is being anti-Semitic because they're criticizing the Israeli government. It's a similar dynamic where if we were actually able to openly and freely hash out and wrestle with our conflicted opinions about Judaism, Jewry, Israeliness, Jewishness, multiculturalism in Australia, how we bump up against each other, Palestinian advocacy, the Arab community, Islamism, jihadism, and talk about this stuff without being so anal about treading on eggshells, then we probably would be coming at this with a greater sense of comity and cohesion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I have no doubt that the vast majority of people in the vast majority of communities want common good, social cohesion, and to be live side by side with their neighbours, irrespective of faith and background. Unfortunately, we're not talking about majorities. And I think there's several things to unpack here. Firstly, precision of what you're talking about is absolutely critical. So if one is criticising the actions, policies of, say, the Israeli government or of Netanyahu or whatever, then do those things. And yet when we see manifestations of anti-Semitism, which by rights of what you've just said should be particular targeted criticisms of policies and actions by a particular government. That's what it is, after all. And yet somehow, with all that being there, we still see these manifestations against Israelis, broadly conceived, many of whom would not agree with the actions of their government, presumably. And, of course, that just bleeds into the idea of Jews. Now,
yeah, it'd be interesting to know whether or not the nurses who were talking about not treating Israelis are including the 1 in 5 Israelis who are Arabs in that.
yes,
You know, if an Arab showed up and was bleeding and they were an Israeli citizen, would they also refuse care to that person?
and this is one of the things, and this is where we move from a normative question about what do we think we're talking about, let's try and define things, to an empirical question. That is, who are they really talking about? What are these things really about? And it's not just in Australia as demonstrated by the nurses, but it's also in research that's been done in Europe, particularly with young Muslim men, that this was published a few years ago, basically Jews, Israelis and various other terms are used pretty much interchangeably by a whole lot of young Muslim men of a particular Islamic bent. In other words, they're indistinguishable in their mind. Now, a lot of other reasonable people, including a lot of reasonable Muslim people, would find, no, there's a fine and legitimate distinction we must make. But again, talking about all this stuff, which requires nuance, factual correctness and precision of terms, this all sounds very difficult at the moment in the sort of maelstrom of hate speech whirling around, where I think very simplistic tools are being pulled off the shelf
it's
for
true.
things that
Also,
are much more complex.
The law is a blunt tool, isn't it? I mean, so you can target very specific ways of talking about something, and then the people will just find a slightly different way of talking about it. I mean, we've seen this happen with respect to Jews, specifically in the aftermath of October 7th, when people just substitute the word Jew with Zionist.
That's right.
And this is not to say that everyone who ever talks about a Zionist is doing this, because obviously Zionism is a separate thing. But they, very popular and influential people in Australia who have hundreds of thousands or millions of followers on social media would be talking about how Zionists love the taste of the blood of Palestinian children, or like Zionists have a bloodlust for, and so on, or that I remember saying Zionists want to pretend that they're not white, but they're doing they're behaving in the whitest possible way, which is to be colonial, white supremacists. Well, who's the Zion? What does Zionist mean in that? White skin, brown skin, like loving the blood of babies? We know what this is. We know what that word is a substitute for. I mean, some people were even talking about the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, but using the IDF, where if you remove the phrase the IDF and you just put in Jews, it would make total logical sense. But it makes no sense whatsoever if you're talking about an army, because they're talking about the characteristics of people.
Yeah.
So hate speech law, a hate speech officer might be able to come into those scenarios and go, well, there's nothing to see here. They're just talking about the defense forces and they're talking about Zionists, which is an ideology, right? Much better to actually sit down with the person and have a conversation about what they're really talking about.
So
hopefully
which is, again,
towards greater wisdom.
While it's painful, and we obviously need robust underpinnings of civility, which of course is now viewed out in a very derogatory lens as being
do we need civility? I mean, I'm always the anti-civility person in a way, because I feel like civility does a similar thing to hate speech legislation, which is it papers over differences instead of just actually have the fucking conversation in the way that you want to.
No, I agree. I wouldn't use civility in the sort of twee sense. I'd use civility as a part of in a civil society. We should be able to have robust, maybe even heated debates, but without constantly drawing a caricature of the opponent. Now, so we're getting a little bit off free speech, but it's all part of the maelstrom of where free speech arguments are at the moment. And I think what's happened is through a variety of things over the last, 10, 20 years, it is increasingly hard to have conversations that are on contentious issues, often because the people who feel slighted by those conversations cry harm. Now, as I've often had to point out to colleagues and people in the community who talk to me, there's a sliding scale of harm. There's sort of Salman Rushdie harm, getting nearly killed by an Islamist with a knife, and then there's causing offence harm. Now, in the
and
mind,
even prior to, sorry to interrupt, but even prior to this latest outrage against Salman Rushdie, you could say, well, when he was completely untouched by any physical harm, he still had his life entirely deranged by words.
And pondering, for those of us that are old enough to remember the Satanic Verses sort of controversy and the fatwa against him, we were screwed then as a sort of liberal democratic society of elites, supposedly, my colleagues in universities, politicians and other so-called thought leaders, public intellectuals, because so much of the response when that initial fatwa came out and a man was basically put on a hit list for writing a book that offended people, it was, well, he's caused a lot of harm and, he's really offended Muslims and blah, blah, blah. Now, the fact that it was so poorly managed at the time, it doesn't surprise me at all that, 30 years later or whatever it is, we're really fucked. Because that was a very early case, and indeed even a landmark case, of the capability to turn around and say, I'm sorry it's caused you harm, but in our society, Western open democratic societies, with all of its faults and flaws and troubled history, etc., causing you offence is something we are perfectly prepared to support him doing. And in fact, you can be offended. We're okay with you being offended. But if you dare threaten the life of this person or any of his supporters, his publishers and others who did pay with their lives around all this stuff.
Yeah, if people aren't aware that there were people actually killed.
That's correct.
His translator, one of his translators was assassinated.
That was a disgraceful scandal of weakness from Western liberal democracies at the time, because already by this stage it was really setting in motion the idea that you have caused us harm, so we're going to harm you. Now, there's a big sliding scale between offending your religion and killing someone. Or if there's not a sliding scale, for those of us that aren't embedded within deeply fundamentalist religious cultures, if there's not a sliding scale, there's a problem. So in other words, if writing something that's offensive to your religion makes you feel compelled to respond with violence, then that's all right, your religion can get stuffed in our society. If we have people in our Australian liberal democratic free society who feel that offending their religion is such an egregious thing to do, they will threaten violence, then you've got to ask, why are you here? And we don't want you here. That's got nothing to do with hate speech and free speech. That's got to do with what are the fundamental values of a liberal democratic society in the 21st century, and what is our tolerance for intolerance. And I see hate speech laws making that conversation even harder, not even better, because someone can then claim, you caused me harm because you offended my conception of the of a sacred text, of a sacred figure, of whatever. And my response is, I'm sorry, you're living in this country. That's going to be the price of living in this country. You can go to lots of countries where blasphemy leads to stoning and death. In fact, majority Muslim countries have blasphemy laws in place. You can go there. You're most welcome to be there. Can we have a conversation about, do we want people in our country? And it doesn't have to be Islamic, by the way. It can be any religious or cultural view that if you take offense that badly, you need to leave those values at the doorstep and not bring them here, as opposed to us empowering them, and indeed infantilizing them by saying, oh no, this speech has caused you offense. It's hate speech.
It's interesting.
God forbid.
I am not old enough to remember the Satanic Verses, but I am certainly old enough to remember Charlie Hebdo, which had a similar ring to it, where I do remember reading very thoughtful pieces by very learned academics and activists in the United States at the time, saying, well, yes, of course, executing people for publishing a magazine is bad, but these people were peddling in the lowest grade kinds of, racial and ethnic stereotypes about Muslims. And I remember being, somewhat persuaded in the sense of just like, not in terms of the justice of shooting somebody, but in terms of like the sort of, what the fuck did you expect was going to happen when you went up and whacked the bee hive? Of course, the bees were going to come out and sting you. And that's such a pernicious way of looking at things, because it's completely amoral. Like
Yes.
sometimes there is a utility in whacking a beehive if the beehive is completely fucked and deranged, and you want to make a satirical point about whacking beehives, then you should be able to do so.
I agree.
And we should stand by you.
Where we have enormous problems now is in the current cultural moment of my truth, lived experience, etc. Is that we've now allowed people who have been able to redefine harm, truth, values in such a way that it turns the tables on what would have been a perfectly sensible conversation maybe 20, 30 years ago about this isn't actually causing you harm, it's just defending something about your religion or your faith. Not saying those things in themselves are good or bad. We'll note, though, through history, there's been a lot of very good critiques of faith, and they are not unique. We shouldn't focus on Islamic faith. It's not like the Catholics and the Protestants haven't had their own trouble over the These things go back in the ages where there is this idea that you can get triggered so badly you resort to violence because someone questions your belief systems. It would have been nice to think we'd got past that with the Enlightenment. But something has now happened where those are they are able to weaponize taking offense and the grievance of taking offense to somehow put it on the same table of conversation about actual violence. And that is absolutely nuts.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit, these people would not tolerate, the person who says, what did you expect me to do? You were offending me so badly, I had to fight back and defend myself because you were erasing my identity or denigrating my identity or something. How much time would those people give to a male perpetrator of domestic violence who said, look what you made me do? You were just, it might not be right that I hit you, but of course you should have predicted that I was going to respond when when you were behaving towards me with so much disrespect. We don't tolerate that in a domestic violence situation, and we shouldn't tolerate it when it comes to people's ideology.
Exactly. And I think you've really landed on what is the core signal or message that something's really stuffed up. And it's when you can't identify the perpetrator and the agency of the perpetrator. We have moved, thank God, to the point where in the case of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, we can talk about the perpetrator and get past those ideas of they were pushed to it or their masculinity was under threat or whatever. No, they went and killed this wife, these kids. It's atrocious. We need to look at their agency. Whenever you hear grievance stories to justify violence, but somehow the actor within that, the perpetrator, is strangely absent, then I think alarm bells need to rise. In other words, we hear about systemic this, or they were caught up in Australia's systemic racism. Now, all of a sudden, we're not talking about the perpetrators and their agency, as we quite rightly do with domestic violence. I would argue, though, that we don't even do that with domestic violence, because have you ever heard about the agency of perpetrators when we talk about Indigenous violence?
Not much.
No. Why is that? In fact, what do you hear in its place? You hear about Australia's dark colonial past, you hear about systemic racism, you hear about X, Y, and Z. Funnily enough, you hear very little about the agency, the motivation, potentially the misogyny and violence of the perpetrator. They are raised from the narrative. And yet, anything other than a particular minority community, we talk all the time about the agency of the perpetrator. So it is very odd that when it comes to mainstream domestic violence, that is the right kind of domestic violence, in inverted commas, we have progressed a long way in the last 10 or 20 years to call out agency of the perpetrator and stop making excuses.
Right, because white, cisgender, heterosexual males have agency. Traditionally disenfranchised communities do not.
Apparently, but the thing is, power is situational.
Justice narrative, right?
Power is situational. So, do we want a professor of critical social justice or something from a university on a tenure position, living in inner city apartments with a concierge, telling us what the agency of violent men are in remote communities? I don't know if we do. Likewise with, closed religious communities of whatever ilk they happen to be. Could be Jehovah's Witness, could be ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, violence towards girls, sexual assault towards young children, etc., in any closed religious, typically, community. We need to be able to talk about what are the things that lead to that, and it might mean at times having very uncomfortable conversations about what are the belief systems and the social dynamics that lead to those things happening, but always with the clear view of the agency of perpetrators. So again, all this stuff gets muddied up with hate speech.
I mean, you're reminding me a little bit. I had a great conversation with Tim Minchin not that long ago, where he was making that point. Yeah, about agent. It's noticed the groups to whom we give agency and the groups to whom we give sympathy.
Yeah.
So I think we were talking about Israel and Palestine, where the mainstream narrative amongst social justice types is that Palestinians are victims who have no agency. You know, the fact that they voted for Hamas is written off as what did you expect them to do after so many years of oppression? The fact that Hamas, slaughtered and raped Israelis is like, well, what did you expect them to do if they were trapped in an outdoor concentration camp? The misdeeds of Israel are given agency. Like, why are the Israelis choosing to do this? Why are the Israelis choosing to do that? And it's revealing about a certain kind of anti-Arab racism, even amongst the people who claim to be the spokespeople for the Arabs. The soft bigotry of low expectations, as Obama put it. Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court Justice, has 100% agency in the eyes of the people who were opposing his appointment for the actions that he took as an apparently misguided, drunken, handsy teenager in college. But a young black kid who acts up is just a consequence of their environment in a way that Bruce Kavanaugh supposedly isn't. So it is an interesting double standard. I mean, the thing about Salman Rushdie, to loop that back in here, would be that in the modern era, it's not the case that people who are aggrieved normally respond with violence. People who are aggrieved in the 21st century respond with a network of tactics that has come to be called cancel culture, or some sort of, I can't quite identify it, but can you speak to that phenomenon of it's not that the victims of a slight against their identity are becoming violent, so we can't pin that on them, but they are behaving in ways that aren't consistent with a traditional vision of free speech.
Yes. And I suppose we can broadly categorize, I think, the discussion around free speech and the risks to it, or the threats upon it, in two ways. One of which is things like overt legislation, laws, sort of black and white things. And then the argument is about how they applied, what are their limits, etc., etc. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is about the sort of the free speech mindset of self-censorship, preference falsification, all the stuff which, if you spent long enough in the academy, and maybe if you spent long enough in the media, that's actually, for me, an issue of at least equal concern. That is to say that it doesn't even make it to the point of being contested in the open, is this a free speech issue? Because the issue itself doesn't even get raised, discussed in any forum with any interest. In academia,
there's not a lot of need for blasphemy laws in Saudi Arabia, because nobody's going to say anything against Islam in Saudi Arabia.
And so look at the incentives and rewards in a university setting. You're a young student. You've done well. Maybe you've done an honours degree. You're hitting it off with your supervisor. There will only be an Overton window of topics that you can do in your area that are the right kind of topics, with the right kinds of methods, with the right kinds of people that you quote, that can even possibly lead you into a successful career in academia. And I've had the case, and this is based on first-hand experience, of people coming to talk to me, both undergraduates and especially postgraduates doing PhD and honours, where they've actually said, I want to look at, give an example, say in the Indigenous space, I want to look at this particular framework of Indigenous culture. And no, they were given Bruce Pascoe's book, Dark Emu, as their fundamental text to work from. Despite the fact that
for non-Australians, this is a book that takes an extremely sympathetic view of First Nations prehistory and has been criticised for actually being overly for exaggerating how peaceful and sophisticated pre-European First Nations,
particularly around farming and agriculture as we frame it now. And it's a work. He's not an academic, although I think he enjoys a professorial position at a university. He's of uncertain academic, intellectual and cultural credibility in the minds of many people. But nonetheless, his book and his message became the thing to, if you like, decolonise assumptions about Indigenous people being semi-nomadic, for instance, and their ways of life and the sophistication, their technology and culture, etc. And so what we have is the narrative and the political correctness of your topic and how you frame it becomes more important than actually undertaking original, critically minded research. And you can multiply that example by 1,000, that by the time you make it to university and you start a research project and perhaps become a PhD student and you're looking at getting some part-time work with, et cetera, you want to get some grants, you want to get references for jobs. If you're known to be the person that goes against a narrative that is just taken for granted within that institutional context, you've got Buckley's chance. So what happens is there is a sorting within what is acceptable, what is not acceptable to even talk about, in a way that I think if you look back in the areas that I'm interested, even 10 or 20 years, so issues of male violence in Indigenous communities, sexual abuse, violence towards women, rampant problems. 10 or 20 years ago, there were social scientists, people that have worked in social work. There was remarkable scholars like Peter Sutton, very, very famous Australian anthropologist, non-Indigenous, but he lived on country and learnt multiple languages, actually pointing out that there are whole areas of concern and study and discussion to have around both traditional and non-traditional elements of misogyny and male-female hierarchy in Indigenous traditional communities. And some of those things need to be discussed in relation to how well those communities are functioning now, also noting the often horrendous effect of colonisation and a whole lot of other things as well. So this is not whitewashing anything. And yet, in the last 5 or 10 years, that literature has practically disappeared. And the only thing we have now when we're talking about, say, dysfunction or disadvantage or the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, it's all around colonisation, the need to decolonise with So as a young PhD student, if you put forward the thesis that I'd like to follow up on Peter Sutton's idea about what he called The Politics of Suffering, was the name of this book. Terrific book. I'd recommend your readers and viewers check it out, certainly Australian ones, Politics of Suffering. A young PhD student says, look, this is a very, very fine scholar, deeply embedded in Indigenous culture, enormous intellectual power, and he had this particular thread of inquiry. What do you think the chances are of that PhD proposal getting through ethics, getting a supervisor to supervise it? Because the whole debate has effectively been quashed. So we don't even make it to the point of this is a free inquiry issue, because no one is stopping you asking those questions. But there is no career to be had, and you can multiply it over any number of wicked social problems.
All right, let me try to articulate this. Let me try to steelman the position that would defend that, if anyone would, which would be to say such inquiries are not hate speech per se, but they are kind of hate speech adjacent in the sense that a little bit like taking an undue interest in the relative IQ differences between black people and white people and Asians, they are either ignorant of or intentionally antagonistic towards an egalitarian vision of society where we reconcile ourselves to the sins of the past, recognize that we live in a white supremacist society, acknowledge that the country is founded on genocide, and anyone who gets their rocks off by trying to get their hands dirty wrestling with precisely how violent or sexist Indigenous males specifically are is suspect to the overarching mission of making the world a better place and uplifting Indigenous people.
No, that's a good steel manning. At least a bronze manning, I would say. So a couple of different things. One of which is if you're genuinely committed to improving the lot of disadvantaged people, you should be, as a corollary of that, you should be interested in what other things that will actually make a practical difference to those people on the ground. So if the betterment of society overall and bridging the gap is absolutely critical, then you should have a passion for what works, and then you look at how you control the narrative and possible negative aspects of how the narrative can be weaponized. I see very little interest in that. The second thing is on a more empirical, this is a more sort of normative approach. On the more empirical approach is that there are eminent Indigenous women scholars who have pointed out precisely this point about Indigenous male misogyny in their communities. Their voices are practically being drowned out because of Indigenous leadership in this country, they claim. So there are people within the communities themselves who are Indigenous who understand or articulate this problem, but they've got Buckley's chance. And again, I commend the work of Suzanne Ingram, very, very fine Indigenous scholar, that has written now several pieces on how narratives of colonisation obfuscate elements of Indigenous misogyny and male violence. And that has been that debate can't even be had even by Indigenous women themselves, because it is so dominated by a convenient argument led by Indigenous men.
Right. That's a good point. So in other words, it's rarely about a white person's perspective and a black person's perspective. It's usually about a white person who usually does carry some position of power because they might have the imprimatur of an institution, an academic institution behind them. They might have wealth privilege and so on, and they certainly don't face racism the way that people of colour do. Them choosing and selecting which members of the minority community get to have their voice elevated and which don't. And we see this a lot coming back to the Muslim community, that there will frequently be a reflexive siding of white social progressives with some of the most regressive and misogynistic voices in the Muslim community, because those voices are able to stand up and present themselves as being spokespeople for that community. And it's actually, there can be a silencing, for example, of the dissident, atheist, feminist 15-year-old Muslim girl, because she's covered in a veil and inside, while we applaud the speechifying of some imam at a conservative mosque.
So I think two things are good follow-up there. One of which is this idea of in-the-room privilege. It's actually the name of an article that was published a few years ago. I can't remember the author, but it really struck me. I think he was a writer of colour from the US. I think it's called in-the-room privilege, and others have referred to it. It's the idea that any university, organisation, business, whatever, they'll have their go-to people that in their own naive view represent or speak on behalf of that community. So you end up with a collection of people around you that might be of different colours and genders. And those that have organised them and arranged them to come in have that perception that somehow they are representative of their community. But that's in the room privilege. They just happen to be the people, rightly or wrongly, who have ended up positioning themselves as the spokespeople for that community. Now, if we want to talk about gender imbalance in some high control religious communities, Muslim or otherwise, then wouldn't it be great to get the 13-year-old teenage girl in? Who's going to do that? Who's going to speak for them? Probably not the 13-year-old girl. If we're going to talk about gay and lesbian youth within these closed communities, who's speaking behind? Now, maybe they're a bit more organised. So there's in-the-room privilege. Then the other thing is that people who position themselves as spokespeople for their communities, yes, they are, and they may even be doing it in perfectly good faith, but they've often got other agendas to push. And when those of us, let's say in the mainstream, are desperately looking for connectivity into minority or marginalised communities, it behooves us to be extra careful about who we end up selecting. Because certainly in the US and in Europe, we've seen the flourishing of organisations like the Muslim Brotherhood, because they have managed to position themselves as being the moderate, non-violent voices of the Muslim community. But in fact, they have a vast array of political and often very anti-democratic agendas to push. But because they're not the violent types that are threatening to cut the head off someone, they're the ones that, if you like, the mainstream folk go to. So you end up with all of these proxy organisations, the Muslim Association for this, the People, etc., that have the facade of looking like they represent an entire community, whatever that means. It's not like there's minorities within minorities. There's dispossessed within minority communities.
And as has been said, the smallest minority of all is the individual.
Yeah, and so we need to be aware, and certainly not naive, that when there are various community spokespeople, there are certain people within those communities, using the term in inverted commas, who will position themselves precisely for that function. And my concern is, when people ask me about my view about these religious things, I said, well, talk to the atheists and the apostates. Talk to the people that have left these high control communities of whatever type, Islamic or not. Get their reflections, because they're the ones that can tell you about what it was like to be ultimately an outsider within a community that has high control over their beliefs and how they're presented. So ironically enough, I've probably got more ex-Muslim friends than Muslim friends, but my ex-Muslim friends often have to travel incognito. This is in Australia. They travel incognito. They're very conscious of their personal security, and they know that they'll get no interest from mainstream Australian progressives who they want to go to the in-the-room privilege of a self-appointed spokesperson for a community. They don't want to go to someone that has been marginalised and left that community and hear their story.
That's right. And you would probably steelman their point of view in a similar way to the way that I just did with the other point of view, in that it would be something along the lines of, why do we need to elevate voices that obviously have a chip on their shoulder and are trying to denigrate a community because they've been excluded by it, instead of trying to hear from somebody who is in line with this community and is all about uplifting and spreading positive vibes about that community. Why kick the hornet's nest, so to speak? And having been a producer before I was talent, so to speak, quote unquote talent, I know what it's like to be putting together a busy show and getting a press release in your email, and it's from some organization or association, and they're offering up a person who has some credibility. People who don't work in the media might not realize anyone out there can just hire a publicist or even do it themselves to create an association of something or other and write a press release that reads like a news article. And journalists and editors and producers are so overworked and so starved for content that they can see it, they can picture in their mind what the news story is, they can imagine what the 6-minute conversation on the Today Show couch will be like, or on the Talkback radio show will be like. They can see how many column inches this is going to fill, and the work is sort of done for them. And it's like, the Association of, Buddhist Australians or something, has come out against the government's blah-de-blah. Okay, let's get this person on. They're the president of the Association of Buddhist whatchamacallits, and that is how it works. And that's how you get in the room. And meanwhile, there is nobody has the time or resources or inclination to dig into whether or not that's reflective of the broader views of Australian Buddhists.
Yeah. And now, let's say the business model in media is such that that's almost inevitable. Let's just say that for a moment. Then what other institutions need to be doing the job to make up for that? And obviously, our universities are key.
I thought you were going to say Substack. Substack is the answer.
Well, it's ended up being the answer. And that's while you've raised that, let's riff on that for a little bit, because the remarkable rise of podcasts, people doing Substack, going back now a few years, that's terrific. I think it's awesome. But you could also take the view of it as being, that's a symptom of a deeply broken mainstream process, because there would be no need to subscribe to your amazing show with your terrific guests. There'd be no need to do all of these people that are sort of they've been in the mainstream, but now perhaps on the periphery doing their own thing, which there's a multitude. Those things wouldn't exist if you could open up your paper every day on your phone or on whatever, and all that stuff was covered, because people would be getting their fill of diverse perspectives, reasonable, in-depth, nuanced discussions, whether you agree or not. At least you're hearing an articulate steel manning of something. That's terrific. Doesn't matter if you agree with it, but at least you've heard it. Because we're not getting that, we've got the flourishing of Substacks and those that are on the margins. And it's not just the Joe Rogans of it's that whole ecosystem of, thousands upon thousands of people with these Substacks of anything from a few hundred to many thousands.
Yeah.
There's a reason they're all there.
Which is not to say there isn't a problem with that as well, because, one of the downsides of the legacy media is that if I touched a subject that is one of these issues, which we know is triggering a tripwire, then I would know that I was going to spend a half a day responding to complaints about it and defending myself. And it was, that there was a high price to pay. That's one of the downsides of being in the legacy media. But one of the upsides of being in the legacy media is that you're going to have to spend a half day responding to complaints if you do want to really go out there and tackle difficult stuff. Whereas going out there and saying provocative things in Podcastistan is consequence-free. In fact, there may be a rewarding feedback loop for it in the sense that you get more and more more and more of an audience. So we're going to have to find some hybrid. I mean, I'm trying to do it myself, but I'm one tiny data point in an ocean. That we're going to have to find some hybrid that has the credibility and responsibility of the legacy media alongside the love of freedom and troublemaking and contrarianism of the independent press.
Absolutely. So it's not like, I'm not saying it's a solution. All I'm saying is it's an inevitable consequence, because the demand is still there to have this stuff, and it's not being met, if you like, within the mainstream. For a variety of reasons. I would say it's not just the business model, it's also the almost, ideological conformity that exists in many of these organizations, that you won't even get a job. You won't, just like within academia, you've got no career unless you're on brand and on message.
Yeah.
And no doubt in journalism, but certainly in academia, the sacred cow of academia is now social justice. In an institution that used to be committed to that twee idea of truth seeking. How quaint is that, So, and yet somehow it's all just been allowed to happen and nobody really talks about it anymore. And so as a result, social justice trademark now cements that Overton window to mean there's a whole lot of stuff you're just never going to talk about, you're never going to study, you're never going to see steel manned, and you're never going to have a career doing it. And that's just it. It's been set, and it's been set now for, I'd say, for several years in academia.
And I mean, the part of what that's throwing up for me is also this misunderstanding of what diversity means, in the sense that, a diverse, you said you want to open the newspaper or open the newspaper's app on your phone and see a diverse range of points of view. Well, newsrooms for the past 10 or 15 years have been working really hard to increase the diversity of their journalists and their writers and their points of view. The entire ABC has just moved to Western Sydney at vast taxpayer expense as a sort of cowardly response to the Conservative Scott Morrison government's attacks on it being an elitist white middle class institution in downtown Sydney. It's going to a more ethnically diverse part of the city. There's a misunderstanding about what diversity is, in the sense that we've become obsessed with a bunch of checkboxes, so that diversity means you hire a lot of people who come from different ethnicities or religious backgrounds or have different sexualities, but we're not focusing on whether or not they are from different classes, what their economic background was, what their education level was, what their political leanings are, whether they have interesting ideological points of view. Those things aren't captured. So you can end up with quite an undiverse sort of sphere of thinking at the same time as you have a maximally diverse, group of identities.
Two things can be true at once, and that is you can have that on the surface diversity, but you can also be in an echo chamber. And then sometimes I want to push and prod that idea of even diversity as it's currently manifest. It'd be great to know how many people coming through certain programs at universities studying towards journalism or whatever it happens to be, how many went to a certain type of selective school, how many lived in a certain type of suburb, how many of them did ballet lessons and music lessons after class, how many of them went to extra tutorials or classes on the weekend, being run around by their parents. There's a certain conformity to that as well. So if there's diversity is almost blindingly a good thing if it's understood to mean the full richness and representation of our complex societies. But we need to think about the filtering that happens and those that remain standing that appear to be diverse at the end. What are those qualities and characteristics that they have that really represent a genuine diversity from a range of perspectives? And that's where I think the classic Marxists are right. They bemoan the lack of interest in socioeconomic background, because that, for most people, is the fundamental exclusion in getting into university, getting into journalism, having an unpaid, position that you got to go to. There's all kinds of exclusions that occur, but in some ways they're colourblind, if I can use that term, which I know is probably triggering for some people, less the truly colourblind. There's a colourblindness that those that emerge through various almost inevitably elite programs will share an awful lot of similar characteristics and privileges in their life. And, there's been prominent examples in Australia where, I can't remember her name and the name doesn't matter, where I think it was a female basketballer of colour was, quite happy to be seen on on marches towards Indigenous Australia and was quite happy to go on the media talking about Australia's dark colonial past and racism. And then she got into massive trouble for calling a teen player from an overseas country a monkey. Now, did that person have a privileged background? Did they go to a private school? Did they ever have financial worries in their life? Does their skin colour privilege them to make comments and judgments about other people based on the quality of their skin colour or based on the actual quality and experiences that lived in their own life? And I think that's a very topical thing at the moment in the sports space. So I think this whole idea of diversity, it's thrown around and it's so facile.
I mean, taking up your Marxist point, it'd be interesting to see if an organisation or an educational institution or a government department wanted to trial a form of diversity of DEI whose sole metric is what was the income. Let's get the income tax records of your parents from when you were born until the age of 15. And
absolutely.
Let's just make sure that we've got lots of people who were in the bottom quartile, for example, of the income bracket when they were growing up.
And
that'd
I know
be fascinating.
It's certainly in Australia, I'm not sure of the statistics, but certainly in the UK, there's a very troubling underclass of young, angry white men that are poorly educated, in systemically poor positions, and even the practical empirical concerns about what might that manifest in the future. But the fact is they are deeply deprived, deeply underappreciated and ignored because they don't fit the right colour coding for diversity. So it really is a matter of what does one mean by diversity and what does one mean by disadvantage? Now, maybe these young, white, angry teenagers that are in unemployed areas of the UK don't suffer from systemic racism, that sort of term that gets thrown around, but they may well be suffering from a whole lot of other deeply entrenched systemic disadvantages that are equally intractable. For example.
Yes, and they don't have the person who can speak on their behalf by putting out the press release and emailing it to journalists to say, like, the representative of what is their community?
Angry white unemployed people.
That's right. Because it's understandably and rightly taboo to conceive of oneself as white with a capital W, and only a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi would do so and would take pride in one's ethnicity, right, in one's race if you're white. As a result, issues that would otherwise be addressed on a communitarian identity basis if they were any other community and would have that press release and would have that spokesperson going on the radio and talking about, what the community of people living with disabilities really needs is blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
You can't say what the community of young white men really needs. I mean, you almost laugh even just imagining it. It's a comedy sketch to have like some unemployed, angry white male talking about the deeply felt historical trauma of his community and how he needs to how they need a better lot in life, which brings us right back to the point about hate speech, which is I got into an argument on Q&A on ABC TV with the Safety Commissioner Julian Mangrant when she was saying that it was hate speech, that it was incitement to violence, and it was I think she said hate speech, but certainly incitement to violence for commentators like Elon Musk and Douglas Murray to, in the wake of the London race riots, say that this was inevitable, that they'd been warning about it, that it was going to get worse, that Britain was headed for a civil war, because that was inciting people to racism. Then it does blow up, and when he says, told you it was going to blow up, everyone says, incitement! Not a solution.
No, and I think hopefully we're not in that state yet in Australia, but we're certainly following all the patterns of hate speech laws, and we're following the same trends that make it harder and harder to have conversations. Now, it doesn't mean to say the conversations won't be hard. It doesn't mean to say that the conversations might requiring people to understand you can hold two contradictory views in your head to at least understand them. That is all true. But it's also true, and I think you pointed this out in your own podcast and reflections on this subsequent to that exchange entanglement that you had with the Safety Commissioner, that the only people left talking about it are the people we do not want left talking about it, because there are genuinely racist, misogynistic people in our society who are not what the vast majority of people want saying things, even if those things are true. So there's a fundamental lack of authority and legitimacy to having difficult conversations. And because of that absolute vacuum of having those conversations amongst people that are actually concerned but prepared to sit down and try to nut it out, it is left to the nutters. And that is doubly bad, because it also means, of course, and you pointed this out, that people on the other side will say, look, they said it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're racist.
That's right. Yes, after that television appearance, I wrote a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald in which I said something like, if the only people talking honestly about the challenge of multicultural integration are xenophobic fascists, then we're in trouble, because people are going to listen to xenophobic fascists if they're the only ones, speaking about it. We have to sort of reclaim the sane centre from the extremes, because people aren't just going to believe bullshit indefinitely. Like they're not going to believe the patina of gloss that we try to put over things indefinitely. At some point, you've got to have a reckoning. At some point, you've got to have the conversation. Either you're going to have a conversation or you're going to have riots.
So the key thing then becomes, what institutions and leaders need to step up to address that absolutely existential threat for, cohesive, safe civil society. And one of the key institutions that needs to be in there are our universities, but obviously media and others as well. Politicians will play political games, but they're doing so to both feed and respond to what they see and hear and what gets leverage. We need to be able to deconstruct and challenge a whole lot of really difficult and nuanced topics in a way that we can be disagreeing, but at least engaging in the complexities of it. Understanding that people may or may not get offended along the way, but perhaps not the usual suspects that cry, I'm offended, this is hateful. And all of that is going to become so much harder if we continue to clamp down on so-called hate speech and to continually intimidate people from raising what they see and hear with their own eyes and their own ears. They know this stuff is challenging. They can see it happening elsewhere around the world. And they're wondering who is taking center stage to start curating with sensitivity and compassion these kinds of very difficult discussions. And we're not going in the right direction at all.
Look, it's hard when you're talking about this stuff, I find sometimes, because people want examples of the kinds of things that you want to be able to say that you can't say. Like sometimes when I have arguments about free speech, a social justice person will say, all right, you tell me, what is it that you can't, you talk about cancel culture. You say right now the thing that you wish you could say that you can't say. I won't tell anyone. What is it? What is it that you can't say? And it's a very difficult question to answer, because it's not like I'm walking around with this desire in my head to say a particular thing that I can't say, but it might be helpful just to say a few things that you could imagine some of these new hate speech laws someday prosecuting. Like, since we were on the subject of Islam, would it be legitimate to say that Islamism that Islamists, for example, are incompatible with Australian democracy, right?
Yes.
That's something that you could imagine being regarded as Islamophobic. It's literally talking about Islamism. And, is that a kosher part of the conversation? I don't know. Is it kosher to, I use the analogy of women aren't as intelligent, but you could certainly imagine saying something like, gender dysphoria is a disease or something, or gender dysphoria is a type of mental illness, something like that. These aren't things these aren't things whose right to say we defend because we like saying them. They're things whose right to say we defend because you're never going to find out exactly what the truth is unless people are having robust conversations about what is true and what is not true, right? Let's just address the trans issue for a moment, because that's probably the one where, I don't know if you'd agree, there's been the greatest level of hypersensitivity or censoriousness in recent years. That's now, unfortunately, in my view, swung back so far in the other direction that you've got really nasty transphobic backlashes, especially in the United States. Don't want to say I told you so, but
you can say it.
I have been saying for years, be careful how far you force people to to swallow a particular ideology, because eventually there's going to be a pushback. But this is one of those areas where points of view, ideas, were coded immediately as hate speech.
Yep.
And worse than that, as actually erasing people's existence. I mean, I was having a conversation with the organisers of an event, and we were throwing around some ideas about various controversial and provocative conversations that we might be able to have at this forum. And I sort of gently suggested the possibility of talking about the media reaction to pediatric gender transitions. And the person who was a member of the LGBTQIA plus community themselves said, well, we're not going to countenance having any conversations that erase people's identities. And then we moved on to the next subject. Or that erase people's existences, I think it was.
Right, which is a very strange turn of phrase.
It's a bit weird, isn't it? What have you made of this arcing wave?
Well, I have some lived experience in the turmoil of it.
You and your lived experiences.
And, you know, we should share lived experience because somehow it enables us to speak more truth than people that have facts and evidence. But anyway, I think there are two. Firstly, and this is not throat clearing, there are very vulnerable people and communities in this domain of conversation whose well-being and care and respect needs to be forefront. Now, when I mean vulnerable, I also mean those that, particularly depending on the categorization, and some people might say I'm erasing, kids with gender dysphoria who might be suffering from a variety of comorbidities, as many specialists would say, psychiatrists and others, as pointed out by major reviews such as the Hilary Cass review in the UK on the Tavistock Clinic, which is still criminally underreported in the Australian media, with the mantra that it's not relevant to the Australian context, which I will note is utter bullshit, because the vast majority of Hilary Cass's review is looking at a systematic review of the robustness of the evidence that underlines gender care globally. It is not UK-specific versus Australia-specific. So to all of those people who have been told the Cass review is not relevant to the Australian context, what about hopping on the World Wide Web, checking out the summary of the Cass review and the various bits and pieces that led to that? You will also note there in some of the material that was in preparation of it, that when an organisation that was brought in, I'll make this point before returning back, that was brought in to discuss attitudes and concerns around frontline healthcare workers working with gender dysphoric young people and children. What emerged as one of the most concerning themes is their anxiety about the poor quality of evidence and the risk of being called transphobic if they raised concerns about the nature of that evidence. And that was from work done with frontline medical practitioners and others, healthcare practitioners. All of that is available for any journalist at the ABC if they wanted to get off their ass, not listen to a trans advocacy group, and go and check their facts first. Then they can decide whether they think the Cass review is relevant to the Australian context. So when I'm talking about sensitivities and being conscious of vulnerable communities, the most important vulnerable community are those kids suffering from gender dysphoria, and however it might manifest and whatever the best outcome for them might be, there is a legitimate and concerning conversation to be had about what is best for their welfare, and that question is not settled. And to reduce it to the idea that we are raising identity or existence of a trans kid completely begs the issue of what is a trans child, who has decided for us what a trans child is. So, and then there's, if you like, the trans community as it probably is typically conceived. Obviously, any hate directed towards them is utterly unacceptable. But then there's also things called sex-based rights. Now, at what point did a person who says that I am a trans woman, there are also the rights of other people as well. One person's rights or one group's rights do not automatically and unreflectively trump another group's rights. So for things like, obviously there's a famous case in the US of Leah Thomas, a biological male who then identified as a female in the swimming competitions in the US, college competitions I believe it was, walking around with no clothes on in the female change room. when the girls complained, they were told to undergo diversity training or whatever it is because of their bias. Now, that's what turned many people. The Leah Thomas case in the US was one of those turning points where a normal person went, hang on a minute. At the very least, there is a conflict of rights. It is the right of a natal female, a biological female, particularly a younger person, to be in a room without a man, without a penis. Is that a fundamental right or isn't it? Or is that right somehow erased because the biological man with the penis says, I'm a woman now, and they've got the rights of those women? These are not insignificant issues, and they cannot be brushed aside by allegations of transphobia or the myopic championing and segregation of so-called trans rights against the rights of all the others that are affected by these things. So if a trans woman goes to a waxing clinic and asked to be waxed, the poor Filipino person that's waxed, is a famous case in Canada, I believe it was a few years ago, whose rights are being, is it the poor migrant woman that's probably on a minimum wage having to wax around a penis? Or is it the person that claims to be a trans woman demanding to have a bikini wax? These are not insignificant matters.
Well, you say they're not insignificant, but the pushback to that would be, actually, they're insignificant insofar as they're vanishingly rare. And the amount of oxygen that they take up in the cultural conversation is completely out of proportion to the number of times that there are, actually people who are disadvantaged or impacted by this. And therefore, there's obviously something else going on, which is a kind of manipulative, emotive, whipping up of kind of mob transphobia about this stuff, because really nobody should be paying attention to it or caring about it apart from the few people who are involved.
Two comebacks to that. How rare is rare enough? That's the first thing. Who decides? Is it 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million? If you look certainly at sort of club and young sports in the US, I think you'll find that there's more than the vanishingly rare instance of pole vaulters, cyclists, runners, sprinters, swimmers who are biological male doing very well. But leaving that aside, what is vanishingly rare? But certainly in the first category we are talking about regarding the lifelong impact of gender-based medicine, I wouldn't say that's vanishingly rare at all. That's actually at some scale, and it certainly was in the UK. It's hard to get the data and the figures here. And of course, that's much more concerning. So the former sort of situation I was talking about where the having a conversation and having a fruitful and difficult conversation about the nature of evidence and expertise that's offered or proffered around these issues of transgender medicine, what the outcomes are, what the nature of the evidence is, what the experiences of detransitioners are, or those that have desisted. All of that, it seems to be, is being captured by a voracious and often quite toxic trans activism that has denied the very possibility that there might be another point of view or another set of data points to this conversation. Now, considering even if the numbers are relatively low by absolutes in the Australian context, these are lifetime consequences to the people affected by these decisions. And we want to know, in Australia as in elsewhere around the world, and they are coming to this conclusion elsewhere around the world, what is the evidence-based nature of the care that we're providing? But my concern from the sort of public intellectual university context is, how have we got to this stage where very real and obvious questions about the nature of evidence and its application have been so utterly perverted by a series of ideologicals and perspectives about what is gender and what is sex? That is deeply concerning, and that will have lifelong consequences one way or the other for a whole lot of people and their families.
I'd add two things to that. One is that on the question of how rare is it, one is that if you introduce the question of women's prisons, which is another thing that comes up, there was some staggering statistic, which I think was in Queensland, but don't quote me on it, where it is a not insignificant number of the inmates in female prisons in some jurisdictions are biological males. I mean, it was, like more than 10% or 15% or something like that. So in terms of the measurement, it depends where you look, I suppose, and at what. And the other point that I would make, which I think is relevant to what you were saying, is one that I'm stealing from Yasha Monk, who said that the trans debate is a good example of what happens when, instead of using persuasion, an activist group tries to pursue social justice through coercion and sort of, silencing of other points of view. You make these very rapid advances because you're using the sword, essentially, and you're making people be too afraid to question it. But they're shallow advances because nobody's actually won over. So if you compare it to a more of a hearts and minds social justice or civil rights movement like gay rights, for example, between the 1960s and the 2000s and the 2010s, basically, the gay rights movement was probably the fastest civil rights success story in the history of the world, because after a brief spasm of run-ins with violent police and so on to get noticed, it's not like it was all pacifism all the way. But as soon as the microphone was in the face of gay activists, they were really preaching a message of unity and universalism, saying we want the same things that everybody does. We want to not be discriminated against when we're applying for home loans. We want to be able to go on a rental application together. We want to be able to visit each other in hospital when we're sick. We want to be able to share our assets the same way. We want love. We want, community. We want family and homes. They didn't say you must endorse anal sex.
That's right.
You have to say it's good. You have to say you like it. You have to say it's perfectly natural. Your auntie and your grandmother have to all, be on board.
Yep, have
with
little
saying
badges,
that it's,
bumper
exactly.
stickers on their old
right.
Holden.
And they have to start putting signatures in their email saying like anal sex, yay, yay, or whatever. Blowjobs between guys, a thumbs up. It was like, it wasn't a coercive ideological movement. It was appealing using persuasion to deeper values that we already share. And unfortunately for trans people, the strategy that was taken by a lot of activists over the past 5 or 10 years was not that. It was a maximalist position of using as much coercion as possible to try to get as many gains as quickly as possible, and that's just come crashing down.
Which is doubly tragic. For a start, amongst, if we say that the transgender community, whatever, I always imagine that's an imagined community. What do they do? Get together every week?
Of course, it's imagined. Yeah, I mean, I'm ostensibly a member of the community because I'm gay.
Yeah, so I'm always, but I do often wonder how many transgender people who look at what the transgender radical activists have done and think, oh my God, there might have been another way to do this or whatever. But we barely know because their voices are drowned out.
I know because I know them.
And they probably don't want to speak because they'd be, just like people of colour get called coconuts when they speak out. I could only imagine what it would be for a transgender person who doesn't believe with these tactics could ever possibly speak out against them. God only knows what that would mean for them. But the other thing you meant about that very sort of coercive element, you only need to go online and look at sort of trans activism marches and protests. Often, someone with purple hair screaming at a 60-year-old woman in a cardigan with a banner saying "suck my girl dick," as if that somehow they're on the right side of history. Now,
like the old lady in the cardigan's going to go, "Oh, I was against you.
That
before,
was my fault."
Yes, very good point.
And and you don't need to be super astute to notice there are some very disturbing, arguably misogynistic trends within transgender activism in its most ugly form. There seems to be something that, and this is what worries the feminist activists often, is they've picked up on there's elements of what looks like deep anger towards women at times. Now, I don't want to psychoanalyze, but there are often very unsavory elements within some of the more radical side of the trans activists. You can see it in their signage. You can see in the way that it's almost overtly aggressively sexual as well. And I often think, I wonder how many transgender people are looking at that shit and going, that isn't what I want, who I am.
Yeah.
And of course, they've been silenced by people that have in-the-room privilege.
Again, it comes back to the 15-year-old atheist feminist Muslim girl who's in the veil inside while we're all listening to the imam. We're all listening to the transgender
whose marriage has been arranged.
Yeah.
So, but again, what interests me from the academic perspective is how have we got here? What's the ecosystem and what are the incentives and disincentives amongst our chattering classes and others that we are arrived at situation, because these are manifestations and symptoms of things that are not working in our civil society at a more deep level. They're not insignificant issues, by the way. They are significant on their own right, but they're also manifestations of something that is absolutely not working in our civil society.
Well, is it reversing? Because I can imagine some people will be listening to this saying, I mean, yeah, you're talking as if it's 2022. Like this, there was a great awakening, and now clearly we're in the throes of some massive kind of backlash, some sort of almost fascistic alt-right backlash in the form of the Make America Great Again movement, the rise of the far right in Europe. In fact, in some respects, I worry that there will be a memory holding of what happened. We're moving so quickly in the other direction that the experience of some of the people who I know, who, for example, lost their jobs as long-time columnists at august newspapers simply for trying to write about the controversy within the medical establishment that was raging around pediatric transgender care, and that some of the most extreme that it almost seems like another world or a fever dream, that it's not that wouldn't happen anymore. Are you not so sanguine about the death of wokeness?
I wouldn't even say I'm cautiously optimistic. Look, it's interesting what's happening overseas, and I think fair-minded, reasonable people, whoever they are, majority or not, have reason to be worried about backlash. Yeah, hopefully in this country, a little bit more sanguine in general, perhaps there won't be the kinds of backlashes and movements that we've seen in some parts of Europe and in the US especially. And let's hope we don't get to the point where that kind of backlash is energized, because it's not a good thing either. Where I'm a bit more skeptical that I'd be surprised if things changed is it's not necessarily a majority view, but there's enough people that are still true believers of these things, peak woke from a few years ago, who have managed to position themselves within important institutions, universities being the most obvious one, but possibly and arguably in other media institutions and elsewhere. And while they might make grudging noises and all the rest of it, there are many true believers amongst them who believe there is nothing wrong with the peak woke we've had, and that it is all a march towards justice. And they see themselves now in positions of position, authority and influence in those institutions, certainly in academia. So if there is going to be a change and that's going to be unwound from the fever dream of 2022, I don't think they'll be doing it themselves. It's going to have to be pushed upon them. And it's going to have to be through some form of backlash or resetting. So I think there's still a little bit of pain. And in the meantime, we've had generations of students come through who will be, they haven't had critical thinking skills. They've had critical theory skills, so-called. It's almost an oxymoron. That contradiction in terms, rather. So I think they've been calling the shots for long enough in our key institutions to have generational downstream impact. So I'll be pleasantly surprised if things do turn around in a moderate, reasonable way over the next few years, whether that's a political solution or some other kind of intervention, if you will, imposed or not from within or from without. But I'm still deeply skeptical and, to be honest, deeply disappointed at the failure of our institutions, universities and their leaders especially, in grappling with this stuff when they could have seen it coming years in advance, and being an exemplary, moderating, reasonable voice amongst all the crazy shit we've been putting up with for the last few years, such that good people wouldn't have lost their jobs and had their careers ruined, such that the potential of actual physical and psychological damage actually being done to people, particularly in the transgenderism space, might not have actually happened or might have been much more reasonably conceived of. So I think I'll be pleasantly surprised if it turns around, but I would love to see it turn around.
Right. And is your model something like, are there models abroad that you look to as being university administrations where they've been able to draw a line in the sand and go, no, guys, you're behaving like children. We're going to uphold the small L liberal principles of free speech and reason and and equality, and we're not going to go down the DEI path to crazy town?
I don't see it here in Australia. Well, I think there's too small. There's not the right critical mass to have enough on the fringes. I think in the US, there's been individual universities that have either taken that path or reiterated that commitment, like the Chicago principle of open inquiry and all the rest of it. But I think in Australia, I still see the woke fever dream feeding its way through our institutions, because there's a whole lot of other drivers to the way that our institutions are behaving, both the sort of neoliberal, corporate, international students, reputational, brand. I don't see any of these things changing soon.
But why wouldn't that run counter to wokeness, a neoliberal corporate a desire to attract international students who probably don't care much about social justice issues?
It's an unhappy marriage of convenience. So, the woke staff and the social justice warriors within institutions detest their neoliberal managers, and the neoliberal managers barely tolerate their woke, social engineering neo-Marxist professors. However, they work to each other's benefit. It allows universities and university vice-chancellors on million-dollar salaries and their cohort and bloated administrations also on high salaries, of which I was on a high salary for a while as well, when I had a viable career as a senior university manager, no longer the case. It allows them to point at all the great social justice and equity work that's being done by the university whilst they drive around in their Mercedes and BMWs and their car parking and all the rest of it, which is fine. If that's what it is, that's what it is. So in a way, it allows you to outsource what takes the place of a social conscience of an institution to a whole lot of nutty radicals. The nutty radicals love it being the social conscience of the university, but it also allows them to do the social engineering they want to do within their institution. So I think they are not on the same page at all.
Social engineering meaning purging of dissidents and
and to make sure that you're really teaching critical thinking and independent thinking skills and inquiry and the capacity to steel man an opposing view. You're teaching the righteous path of what you're going to do in your discipline.
Right. A decolonial diversity, equity.
All that grab bag of hashtags that you throw together, that is basically your social justice warrior, social engineering now. So whilst the two sides of things, the managerial class within the university and many academics, and we're making very broad brushstrokes,
of course,
here, partly for comic effect, but hey, I'm enjoying it. They are working in concert. They're like some sort of parasitic relationship of some ancient sea creature where one thing feeds off another.
One of those little fish on the edge.
It does, and they're actually three organisms together, but they'll still sting the shit out of you if you go swimming in the ocean. So there's a strange symbiotic relationship between people with very different views and attitudes, but they work in this context.
I mean, it sounds not dissimilar to corporations at the moment, where they're able to distract attention from actual policies of economic justice, for example, that would imply higher corporate tax rates in order to fund, ways of uplifting those bottom quartile that we were talking about when we were talking about actually getting greater diversity, greater economic egalitarianism, healthcare for everybody and all that sort of stuff. Corporations are able to dodge that conversation by leaning into diversity and equity and inclusion programs and showing how highly they score on the LGBTQIA plus, diversity metric and all this sort of stuff. That's right. Putting the rainbow flag in their Twitter bio and whatever it might be. I
agree. So look, that's the sort of greenwashing, woke washing, trans washing, whatever you want. I don't know what it is called. In university, it's more insidious though, because these are the people that we're trusting our children to get an education in critical thinking and open-mindedness and steel manning, and I worry that they're not. So there will be pernicious long-term effects that I don't see washing through anytime soon. Having said that, I'm really heartened by the number of young people who are coming into universities with an open-mindedness and a thirst, perhaps to be controversial, to be challenged. So rather than the sort of safetiest nursery of universities that they might have got used to in the past, I think young people are listening to podcasts. They're watching Substack. They're watching, content creators, good, bad, or different. So if there is any hope, I think there is definitely hope in younger generation coming through who perhaps all this sort of fever dream of wokeness that's been around for the last few years, that for them, that is their orthodoxy. And they might be getting sick of it. They might want to break out from it. So there are glimpses of optimism there. And I get little bits of feedback through my teenage children when they're at school and what's going on. They just go, some of this stuff's crazy that we're hearing in school. So around identity, gender and things like that, there's almost open mocking of some of these programs from the kids at school now because they're just not buying it. And it might also depend on the cultural background they come from.
Yeah, right.
Ironically enough,
Yeah.
often minority cultures, we shouldn't assume that they're on the trans train as much as,
Or
imagine.
the any train.
Any train.
Or the any woke train.
Because they're often
minority communities
deeply conservative, deeply family-based.
They can be among the most homophobic. They can be among the most
That's right.
anti-First Nations. They voted in large numbers against creating a body for Indigenous Australians in the referendum that we had about that last year. It was not.
And look, in the UK,
not Chinese
where
Australians who were in favour of
there were protests by Muslim parents against sort of gender programs being run in the school regarding sex education, openness to different gender ideas. The classic sort of rainbow unicorn type things. The gender-bred man, or whatever it happens to be. They were running a program like that, and the Muslim community was vociferous in its protest against that. And I think those kinds of incidents of cognitive dissonance are wonderful, but there is so little reflection upon them. Is it that these minority people in a systemically racist culture just don't understand what us well-meaning white progressive people are trying to teach their kids? Working your way through that these things are not bugs, they're an actual feature of the symptom, and yet there is so little interest in talking about them.
Let's wrap with a conversation about hate speech and what constitutes hate speech online, and because we haven't touched much on social media and algorithms and what you're allowed to say there. So Julian Mangrant, who's the e-safety commissioner of Australia, the person who Elon Musk calls a censorship czar, or censorship commissar, I think he called her, and with whom I appeared on Q&A on the ABC, has recently lost a court case. Is that right? Or it's a tribunal hearing?
That's correct.
With someone whose content on Twitter, on X, she had informally had suppressed. What happened?
So that was a case recently in the Administrative Review Tribunal, which is the successor to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal for those in Australia. That's what you'll know it from those names. For those overseas, it basically means
I don't even know it from those names.
It's the government body that is allowed to review decisions made by the government or on behalf of the government.
Right.
So it's like an appeal space, but for government-led decisions. So the E-Safety Commission obviously being part of the government's apparatus.
It's an appeals court for citizens to challenge what the government's doing.
If you will.
Yeah.
And so there was a social media content creator called Celine Baumgarten, also known as Celine Against the Machine, terrific social media handle. She had, I still can't say X'd, she had tweeted something about, I think it was a gay or trans or something club at a primary school, some kind of genderqueer club at a primary school. And she is of the gender critical persuasion, where she actually was tweeting about why is there this, I think it was queer club at a primary school, endorsed by the school presumably and all the rest of it. That tweet, there was a tweet, and I think there was something on Instagram. The tweet on X got geo-blocked through an action from the E-Safety Commissioner. Celine went through various appeal processes and arrived at the Administrative Review Tribunal, and the decision was led by a federal court judge. So this is a very significant and weighty decision of considerable importance in our country, and I think arguably overseas as well. And what emerged was that whilst the E-Safety Commissioner can and is legislated and able to direct a social media platform to take down something through a formal notice, if it's in breach of certain sort of requirements regarding hate speech, etc., vilification, what has actually been happening in practice through the E-Safety Commissioner's office is that hundreds, and I think well over 1,000, tweets or equivalent have been taken down through informal notices. So what's happening is her team are sending a notice to the platform to say there is a complaint about, we'd like to take blah, 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 take it down. And in the case of X, those that received it actually took it to be a formal takedown notice. And of course, you're not going to stuff around if you get a formal takedown notice from someone that can, fine you.
From the government, yeah.
So they went and took it down. Now, the problem is, if it was a formal takedown notice, there would be the opportunity for the person who's had their post taken down to get basically to appeal and to basically see what are the workings of this. Tell me
and
the
certainly
justification.
To be notified.
To appeal,
I mean,
and to be
the
notified.
question also that some people wouldn't have even known
that
their
correct.
tweets were
And in
down?
fact, many people, unless they've checked may well have had their tweets taken down through this mechanism, and they would have had no idea. Now, Celine Baumgarten appealed this, and despite the fact that the E-Safety Commissioner felt that it wasn't something that could be appealed because it was informal, the Administrative Review Tribunal decided otherwise, that it had, in effect, it was a formal takedown notice because that's how it was received and acted upon by X. And so, as a result, you've got this very opaque system where hundreds, if not thousands, of takedown notices are happening informally with a complete lack of transparency. And this is what...
But that has now been ruled illegal.
That it has. And basically, it's probably a little bit too technical, but people can look up the case if they wish. Administrative Review Tribunal, it's the case of Celine Baumgarten and the Safety Commissioner. The judge is very clear that this is simply not the way it has to work, that it needs, if it's going to be a proper formal takedown notice with all of the mechanisms for appealing, transparency, accountability, but you cannot in effect have what's taken to be a formal takedown notice as far as how it's received and used, but with all the lack of transparency of saying, oh, it's informal, so we don't need...
I mean, to an American listener, this will sound extraordinary because it embodies many Americans' dystopia of where hate speech legislation could lead and why the First Amendment is so important. So, I mean, just to clarify to the American listener, we live in a country with no First Amendment. There is no constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech. We have a newly created government position which is in charge of online safety and protecting people from harm online, which includes hate speech. That person, that office in the government, is able to send requests, really, when it comes from the government, it's a demand, not a request, because it's backed by the force of the law in this country. And, no company wants to not be able to operate in a medium-sized economy like Australia's if they can avoid it. They can send a demand saying, delete this tweet without the person knowing, and that
nor any recourse to appeal.
With no appeal, and your speech on that platform can be essentially poured over and eliminated according to essentially the whims of a bureaucrat as to whether or not your speech is transgressing a set of hate speech rules, but fundamentally. But now that's been
the concern now is here.
Now at least you have to be told, and you can appeal it.
But the tweet did not even meet the threshold to be formally taken down. So that's it's in a way it's even worse. And I note with some irony that in your entanglement with the Safety Commissioner on the Q&A session, that ABC sort of panel talk show that you're on, you were both in furious agreement about the need for transparency. This is a very disturbing case of a lack of transparency. And I think it raises two things. Firstly, there's the hate speech laws, particularly if they pertain to the online space themselves. What is hate? What is not hate? Where do we draw the line? What are the thresholds? What are the consequences? What are the appeals? There's that, the sort of legalistic side of things. And then what this case highlights that's particularly concerning is there's the actual application in practice of those bodies or government agencies or departments or roles of what are they actually doing in practice. And in practice, they weren't even doing what is evident from the sort of black and white stated law itself.
Right.
So I've got two issues. It's the lack of transparency of what is actually happening on the ground when there's a takedown notice. What form does it have? Where's the accountability? Who's deciding on what grounds? And then there's the actual, well, what does the law say about what you should be doing about them? So there's two sort of separate conversations to be had. And obviously, once a piece of legislation's in, it's in, I suppose. And then the concern is how is it actually being used in practice?
I mean, this is the conversation that we're having with the hate speech legislation at a federal and a state level as well, which is, what do you include as hate speech? Against whom must hate speech be directed in order to qualify as hate speech? What protected classes are we going to list? There have been some complaints that the new hate speech legislation includes religious or racial minorities, but doesn't include LGBTQIA plus people. Like, in which case, if it did include them, then would a tweet such as the tweet that said men aren't women which is one of the tweets that actually got removed by Twitter in its pre-Elon days for being hate speech, and is the kind of thing we're talking about here, the e-safety commissioner being opposed to innocent Australian eyes viewing. Does that then become a criminal offence that could attract jail time if you were to express that against a protected class? It all becomes, once you start, to loop back and close out with the reference to my first point, which is, why can't we just jot down on the back of a napkin the statements or ideas that we all want to rule out of bounds in our civilized society? I suppose you've convinced me that the answer to that is that we will never agree on what goes on the back of that napkin. That's why. We just can't.
I think so.
We will not. It will be an ever-expanding napkin. If you say
it'll be a tablecloth's worth. It won't be.
It'll be a tablecloth. And if you put in, you can't say your Jews caused all the wars in the world. Then pretty soon you're not going to be able to say, I don't know, men aren't women or whatever else it might be. Everyone is going to feel that they have standing to be included in a protected class at some point. Best to adjudicate it with reason rather than with law.
And by talking openly and being as reasonable as possible, even if it's heated disagreement. There's nothing wrong with heated disagreement. That is not causing you harm. Getting passionate about an issue is not harm. And if you think it's harm, you're in a very cold society.
Yeah. All right. You want to wrap us up with a pitch about the Free Speech Union? How can people get involved?
So, Free Speech Union,
what are you guys doing?
If you look up Free Speech Union Australia, you'll find our website. Don't type in FSU Australia. I think it takes you to the Financial Services Union, which may well be a very fine body of people.
I'm sure it's fabulous.
But it's not us. We've got a very active LinkedIn page. And as my daughter says, LinkedIn's like the Facebook for even older people than Facebook. However, that's that. We're on Twitter/X, and we're on Facebook as well. So please check us out. See some of the cases and the work that we've done. So either through me or particularly my colleagues, Ruben Kirkham especially, and Dara McDonald, have done various interviews and podcasts in the past. So please check them out. Consider joining if you're of interest, but at least follow what we do. And we just enjoy people following what we're doing, raising the conversation, raising the awareness about free speech issues in the country.
Alan, good luck to you. Thanks for being here.
Cheers, mate.